Awesome. So welcome to all the participants of Angel Beat. I'm very excited to be here and really looking forward to share as much as I can based on my experience with Google Cloud Security in our time together. Obviously, in the next 40 minutes, you probably won't be an expert at Google Cloud Security unless some of you are already are, but really hoping that each and every one of you can learn something and take away some tips and tricks on making your cloud more secure. By introduction, my name is Gautami and I'm a CE, which stands for Customer Engineer, specializing in infrastructure modernization, data analytics in media and entertainment vertical industry. I have worked with a lot of Fortune 500 companies for the past 5 years, helping them really meet those business goals through technology. I have also helped at my time at Google a lot of these customers building their security and building their entire Google Cloud application ground up. So that's something, security is the crux of all the conversations we have had. Today we will, let's see, yeah. Today we will go over these following things. So first we'll talk about how Google approaches security. How can you organize your resources onto GCP? So the fundamental concept of resource manager. Then we'll touch base on some of the identity management issues and also at the same time talk about network security, operational monitoring, data security, and zero trust. I know we have a lot of content to cover, but my colleagues in the later half will touch upon a lot of those anthos and multi-cloud things that Ron was talking about. But this session is mainly focused on getting you started with GCP and helping you with the fundamental concepts that is needed to make your cloud more secure. It's no surprise that one breach can cause millions of dollars loss to company. And more importantly, the trust of your customers are at stake. It's increasing awareness around security is key with a lot of these organizations. And echoing to what Ron said, there have been a dedicated team in these organizations called as the Office of CISO or security team that really focuses on making sure that your team and your organization is secure. If you're not thinking about security, then you should, unless you are this guy from this creed, which says that, his data is so disorganized that maybe he shouldn't even think of securing it. Now let's talk about how Google manages its security. So we believe that security is the center of innovation. It takes security and our customers, we take them extremely seriously, and all our services are built in with security in mind. Google has invested hundreds of engineering teams dedicated only for security and to make sure that we have everything that is needed to have your applications, your infrastructure completely secure and reliable. Now let's talk about some of the key elements of Google security, which is our entire infrastructure. Google's infrastructure is no surprise to a lot of us. There are different zones and regions that you can leverage. As of today, there are about 24 regions and 73 total zones. You can truly have a global presence and serve your customer with this entire set of infrastructure. One thing I want to let you know is probably these 24 and 73 zones keep on changing very frequently because as I'm speaking, I'm sure there is a team planning a launch of a new region and new zone. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because I want to kind of mention that, okay, this is the global presence that we have and the security is kind of at the center of all of this. You can consider these zones as kind of data centers, which we will learn more about in terms of what are the layers of security implementations that Google has done. Talking about the global network and the points of presence, we have extremely variant points of presence throughout the world, and Google has its own network optic fiber cables connecting through these points of presence. There is an internal ongoing joke that it's shark resilient because there was apparently a shark who tried to bite off the network and still the network did not lose any connection. So just a fun caveat there. Now, talking about really the various layers of security that we have in our hardware infrastructure is from hardware service development, user identity, storage services, internet communication, and operational security. Starting from the server boards, we design our custom chips. We design it with high security. There is this custom chip that many of you security enthusiasts might know, which is Titan, which is kind of built specifically for our security needs. All the RPC calls that happen throughout our network is cryptographic and encrypted at all levels. So also there is a two-factor authentication that goes on. As Google employee, I have to literally, like, obviously there is password that I need to put in, but also we have something called as the security key, which is the two-factor authentication that is applicable not only as employees, but also throughout our data centers. So not spending a lot of time, I just wanted to kind of lay the grounds in terms of this is really what we do for a living, and we want our customers to kind of take advantage of the same. Now we will talk about a lot of things during this session, and I wanted to highlight some service availability launch stages. So in the future, when you read articles about security or you read articles about these new products that are being launched, I want you to make sense of it. So obviously the early access and the alpha programs are nothing but they are limited to a closed set of groups, and they are made available just to take your input and feedback based on as the product teams are building these applications and products. And obviously beta and GA is applicable to, can be seen by everyone. Beta obviously doesn't have an SLA and doesn't have support, and GA is generally available to everyone. If you haven't dedicated account team in your organization, then make sure you ask your customer engineers, your account executives to give you access to these early access and alpha programs so that you can see before the product actually launches and shape some of those conversations with them. Now with that, I really want to get to the first topic which I wanted to talk about, which is planning and setting your organization. Now, the diagram that you see on the screen is nothing but an organizational structure. So Google Cloud is extremely unique in doing things. The main aim for us is making your environment highly secure, but also something which is digestible and not so complex to understand. So GCP provides your entire organization with a container of resources, at the heart of it being the root node as organization. So there are these organization folders, projects, and resources in the same format that I said that helps you kind of bring all these resources together in a best practice way. The best practice is to map this entire organization similar to your organization as is now. So for example, you might have different teams like development, functional teams, you might have separate marketing organizations, or there are some subdomains that are inside your main domain, things like that. So the idea is to really map that to this organizational structure so that in the future, it's just easy to kind of build on top of it. A lot of times customers take this extremely lightly, but we believe that this is the main priority that we should start with when building the foundational knowledge of your cloud security. Without planning the structure and the organization for your Google Cloud Platform environment, managing and securing your environment might be ad hoc, inconsistent, and incomplete. So we recommend take time in designing this entire infrastructure and your environment, which will pay off a lot of the complexities that might come down the road. Moving on to the next slide. So this talks about, now I want to kind of deep down in terms of each of those nodes that we spoke about. So first is organization, second is folders, resource projects, and then resources. So at the root access level, you have organization, which is created using your domain. So for example, google.com is an example of a domain which would be your root or the organizational root that will have all the access to your GCP resources. Some of you might be G Suite customers and some of you might not be a G Suite customer, but that's absolutely fine, because if you have the domain, you can actually access your entire organization by using something as cloud identity, which we will get to in the later slides. but understand that organizational is your root node. You can set a lot of policies, which is policy is a collection of binding one or two members in a single role to make sure that all the access is given at the org level. If there are any folders that has sensitive data or things like that that you want to mask from the entire organization, then you can do so at the organization level. So this is really the father of all the resources that will be there for your org. The second concept is really the folders. Folders is a layer below your organization, and folders can be multiple. So you can literally go like 300 folders deep. So you can have nested folders within each other, and you can go 10 levels. You can create 300 folders vertically, horizontally, and then you can create 10 levels deep. So for example, I can create like Ron's folder, for example, then I create my folder. So this way you can create up to 300, and then you can have multiple nesting inside it up to 10 levels. So this gives you a lot of room to play around with your child folders and your parent folders and make sure that you are actually utilizing a lot of it based on your architectural needs. Then talking about nothing but project. Project is the most important concept of all. So it is the trust boundary for all your resources. Project is nothing but it is a collection of all the resources. So it kind of gives you a boundary for your resources that are across all these folders and all these organizations that we are talking about. So usually folders are mapped to these resources, and all the controls can be applied at this project level with your IAM roles, service accounts, networking, and your instances, things like that. Always remember that project provides management of resources and also billing accounts. So all the billing account knowledge that is required for that particular resources is mapped against the project. By default, a user can create a project in the domain unless you disable project creation at the org level. So this is something that a lot of organizations do, that they want to have a centralized project creation team or a delivery engineering team that wants to make sure that, okay, only our team can create projects with the right guardrails. So in that case, you can disable project creation at the org level, which is kind of a best practice. So remember that you can always map these projects to your teams as well. So that brings me to my first very tip, and we are going to talk about these tips throughout this session for you to kind of remember it. So use multiple projects for separate and various environment and various teams. So what do we mean by that exactly? So an alternative approach in provisioning these projects is having cost centers and your billing departments per project. So for example, if you have your development environment, you have your production environment, you have a UAT, create projects for each of these single environments. You can also create different teams project. For example, there is a marketing team, there is a sales team. So you can really play around with this entire set of resources as you need. You can create it at the folder level, you can create it at the resources level. So depending on how complex your organization is, this is something you should remember, that whatever mechanism works for you is completely customized for your organization. Moving on to those guardrails, right? Without the guardrails that you have in the organization, users can put your organization data and resources at risk. So make sure that you understand what is inheritance and IAM inheritance. We will talk about identity and access management in the later slides, but basically a policy is nothing but the binding. So the effective policy across all these resources are nothing but the union of all policy. That brings me to actually my next tip, which is that make sure that you set less permissive policy at the organization level and stricter policy as you go down. If you don't give access to your policies at the organization level, then it would be kind of difficult for the projects and folders underneath that to open up, because always the org policies will take precedence than the others. So that's something you want to consider. So you can actually have all the guardrails at probably the folder level. If there is a team, if there is a folder that you have created for financial services team, then make sure that you are giving access only to those folks and restricting access for some specific sensitive buckets that you might have that contain sensitive file, and mask it from other organizations. Now, with that, I want to move on to the next concept, which is identity and access management. So I think we spoke about it on a high level, what about cloud identity, but let's see what exactly we mean by it, right? So cloud identity is your centralized managed administration to enable your users in your organization. So we spoke about domain, we spoke about G Suite, and we also spoke about non-G Suite users. So G Suite, which is now Workplace. So if you are a Workplace customer, then you have a G Suite admin already in place. So that person can actually access from admin.google.com, who's the domain owner for your organization. Now for you, if you are a workspace user, to enable GCP is extremely easy. You just enable GCP at the admin level and then give access to those users in your organization, to your who is your GCP team, to those resources. So that's pretty straightforward. But what if you don't have Workplace or you don't have G Suite? Then there is something called as cloud identity that it will help you do that. So cloud identity acts as a single pane of glass, which is accessible with the same link, which is admin.google.com. We have two versions. One is free and one is the enterprise version. And there is a comparison tool online that you can review that what are the differences between the two. But basically you register your domain, make sure everything is placed, all the nuts and bolts are in place, and you give access to the users that want access to GCP. So that's how you manage it. So there are two types of accounts when it comes to user identities. You have your managed and you have your unmanaged. So if you registered your domain via something called as cloud identity, then that becomes your managed resources. So if I have my organization called Gautami.com, then all my users with the same email ID will have access to GCP if I have set up properly. If I don't go through cloud identity, then anyone, literally anyone in my organization can have an unmanaged access to GCP. That means whatever projects the person under my organization creates, I don't really have access to it. Hence, one of the best practices is to have your org domain registered and make sure that everyone inside your organization falls under your org at the root level. Now, there are various ways to make our lives easy if you already have something called as a directory, right? A lot of people use LDAP using Microsoft or other semantic layers as well. So basically, we meet them in the middle, right? So we have something called as Google Directory Sync to automate and manage your users and groups in a centralized fashion. So there is a one-directional sync that can happen between GCDS to cloud identity so that you don't have to manually create these users in your org. So say, for example, you have around 5,400 users, then you can have a GCDS sync directly to your identity. It could be users, it could be groups, and you could actually replicate the same model of identity in your GCP by doing so. So this is a very easy way to kind of, we meet you where you are with your identity needs. Now, let's talk about what IAM really is. So IAM is nothing but your identity access management, right? The fundamental concept is who can do what on which resources. So the who part is, it can be a user, which is myself or you for your organization. It could be a service account. Service account is nothing but a robotic access. Or it could be a group. So the who part is nothing but a person, or actually a robotic access is the who part. On what resources is nothing but your resources, which is your project, organizational, your VM resources and things like that. You can actually have these assigned at the org level and decide that, okay, this is something that you give access to particular resources. So basically this map kind of shows you that, as I said, the who part is nothing but your user account, service account or a group. Then on what is nothing but the IAM role. So IAM role, we will get to it. Role is a set of permissions that enables these who to define what in what resources. So basically, if I am a user and I want to access a particular bucket, then the IAM role would be a bucket viewer, which is the what part, and uh, and the resources part would be the actual bucket location that I want to access. So that is really the crux of the concept that we will talk more in detail about. So IAM is set in GCP console and not on the admin console. So we spoke about managing all those resources that you have into your GCP setup, but now we are talking about IAM, which sits in the GCP fundamentals. IAM lets you assign granular access to specific GCP resources and control who has what access. There are three types of IAM roles. One is primitive role, which is a basic role like viewer, editor, owner, which is broadly scoped. So when GCP was actually built, this was the first set of roles that was given to a lot of users. Then eventually it was realized that these are too permissive and these are too broad, right? So you can give an owner or an editor to someone, but it's extremely challenging because it doesn't really meet the least privilege principle, unless obviously you want someone to have an owner role for them to manage the entire resources. So came predefined roles. So predefined roles are more granular, they are more enterprise focused and limited permissions to grow your services. It uses the concept of least privilege principle to its core. And the last but not least is something called as custom roles. Your custom roles are basically nothing but your customized predefined roles where you can actually choose which permissions you want. One example I can give is, for example, if in my organization there is a data team that needs access to the storage bucket, but also needs access to BigQuery, then I will create a custom role for that particular individual to give two set of permission for two different resources as custom. So that is something that you could use if you have like teams that go bi-functional, like in terms of having two responsibilities. Predefined role is nothing but for a particular resource. So BQ admin or BQ or storage bucket viewer, this will be predefined roles for that particular resource. Now, one thing to remember for custom roles, that if you create a custom role from a predefined role, then all the set of permissions that come from predefined role are copied over. But obviously, there are a lot of changes as well that happens in these predefined roles. So not all of those changes are replicated or will be updated automatically. What do I mean by that? So for example, there is a predefined role called BQ user, which basically means that I can run my queries on the BigQuery dataset without any problem. But if I make a custom role to copy those set of permissions for BQ user and add a storage, and say after a few weeks, the predefined role, which is BQ viewer, has 3 more permissions in it, then those 3 more permissions won't be added to your custom role. So that is something you want to be more careful on while using custom roles. But as a best practice, we always suggest you to use predefined roles because they are more granular, but also at the same time, it's easier to manage as well. That brings me to my second tip for the presentation, which is you always copy your predefined roles as base while creating custom role. So you always want to have your predefined role as a copy and then add whatever roles you have instead of creating custom roles from scratch. And that brings me to the next step, which is use group instead of individual users whenever possible to assign roles. We spoke about the who part, which is individual users. There is also a concept called as group. So for example, if there is an admin, instead of giving just one person an admin role, I want to be able to give an admin role to probably potential 2 or 3 people, because what if my admin goes on vacation, or what if there is an emergency that I need access to where the admin is not available? So in that case, the best practice is to always use group instead of individual users, because that's very efficient and easier to manage. Now I want to kind of focus on some of the exciting things that are coming up in terms of smart access. So when we say security, as I mentioned, the crux of it is make sure that we are secure, but also it's something easier to manage. So these are the three upcoming changes that were made in our policy management, which could be interesting for you. So large organizations often find IAM a little complicated. So policy intelligent tools help you to understand these policies better and really help you to improve your security. IAM recommender is nothing but it helps you enforce the principle of least privilege by ensuring that the members have only the permissions that they actually need, and have a look at your setup and suggest changes based on ML recommendation. Again, machine learning is also something that we add to each of our resources, so that if any time there is a particular update that needs to be done, then there is this extra machine learning algorithm that runs to suggest you, okay, maybe you have given John Smith 2 extra permissions that he might not need. So do you want to update that? So that's why IAM recommender is amazing, because it will suggest you that, okay, these are the users that have gotten extra permissions and I need to kind of, give them less permissions for them to do that. Policy simulator lets you to see how an IAM policy change might affect on a person's access before you commit these changes. So consider this like a preview to your actual changes that you might want to do in the future. So that's something which is very cool. Access troubleshooter is helpful to understand as rules get more complex, and it shows you all the rules that might affect by deleting a particular access or an error you might get on writing some. So again, like with the combination of access troubleshooter and validator, you can actually play around with a lot of these without even making actual implementations. So check this out. These are the 3 newest updates that will help you kind of, suit your identity and access management needs to a great extent. Now we touched upon service accounts, but what are service accounts exactly? So service accounts are nothing but a robotic access without human intervention. It's the most safest, if obviously set up properly, secure way to get to your resources. There are 2 types of service accounts. One are system generated. So whenever there is a compute engine that is created for the first time, then a service account will be automatically created for them to actually spin up those resources. And the second is user generated service account, which is you, I, or anyone in the org can actually create. It belongs to project, and unlike user store that lives in cloud identities. So service account whole and soul lives and dies in GCP, unlike cloud identities, which can be created at your identity level, which is outside GCP. Now these service accounts are global resources, and you can create up to any number of service accounts in a project, but it will give you access to actually have these to your resources. Service accounts can also act as identity. So for example, if I have an access to a particular service account, then actually I can control that what the service account can access in terms of compute and resources. So for example, if the service account has access to a particular storage bucket, and if I have access to the service account, then I also can see what is inside the storage bucket. So you have to kind of, be double sure that, okay, you are giving the access to the service account properly and configuring it correctly. But these are the most secure way where your compute and networking needs are kind of met. Now let's move on to something which is fundamentally important, which is your network security. So what is network security? So some of the best practice of security comes from your networking concept. You want to make sure that everything is secure, the inbound and outbound traffic is encrypted and good to go. So VPC is nothing but our virtual private cloud, which logically isolates these networks and define what you want in public versus private in complete isolation. The crux of the solution or the crux of the concept, which is important here, is firewall rules. Firewall allows you to meet special access privileges that are required for this complete exfiltration. Each of these network functions, distributed firewall, you can allow and deny traffic as you want. So again, in order to design a proper networking system, you should have a great VPC connection and also at the same time, make sure that the resources are isolated from each other. Some of the characteristics of VPCs are as follows in terms of GCP per se. You have your RFC 1918 addressing only, and then the network is unicast. By default, you can have SSH, RDP, ICMP allowed. There is a basic network setup that happens when you create a VPC design, but make sure, and we will get to the tip in the later slides, as you want to make sure that you create your custom network and not rely on the default one that is created for you. Unicast is basically a single direct request from one host to another, and only the two hosts can interact with an established route. So that's a concept which is extremely important, and some characteristics. These are some best practices in design tips that you want to make sure that you're following, which is first is creating your custom networks using GCP, which is extremely important. You want to avoid the CIDR ranges that might later conflict. Then you want to minimize the number of subnets as well, which is nothing but the dividing factors between your network. Have your proper subnets that are extremely important for having it. Then there is also something called as private Google APIs. If you want to turn it off, you can. So things like that. Again, like these are tips that you can review offline, and we'll be sharing the deck for you as well. Now, let's talk about how network firewall rules act in on-premise versus your GCP firewall. So this again is a concept that probably all of you might know, but most network firewalls traffic between the subnets, which is one of the reason we have become accustomed to using subnets in a separate system. So network firewalls must be redundant and highly available in order to prevent any loss of communication between these systems. Traffic between systems within the same subnet is not filtered by the network firewall. Enters cloud. So in cloud, firewall rules filter traffic between each network interface. They provide a more distributed enforcement for more granular control. Because GCP firewall rules are applied at the virtual networking level, using them presents no performance bottlenecks or a single point of failure. The firewall rules are included at no extra cost, and there are no applications or operating systems to manage. Every VPC network firewall has a distributed way of managing your network, and hence it is extremely effective to use multiple subnets or even have a more secure way of mapping your firewall rules onto GCP. Now, attaching your firewall rules to VM. So this is also extremely important, because you want to make sure that you are using those VM network tags that allows your connections to be secure, and also to the crux, important for them to connect securely. Accessing your VMs via SSH, you can also access them via this third party called PuTTY, but you have to obviously expose port 20 in order to enable that for the same. That brings me to my next tip, which is use service accounts to apply firewall rules. We learned a little about what service accounts are. Now, how does that actually happen when it comes to real life scenarios? So applying the right firewall rules to the right VM in an environment is a way to provide least privilege access to the network, which is required for the networks and applications to connect securely. While both tags and service account can be used as flexible VM instances grouping mechanism to which firewalls can be applied, there are main differences which are in use. One of which is your service account are ACL'd. You have to be explicitly granting permission for the VMs to sign up for a particular service account, and tags are not ACL'd. So anyone can spin up a VM and then add the tag to a particular value to his or her VM. So this is something that you want to make sure that you are applying. So you have your firewall rule, which are applied to your service account, and eventually the service account are applied to compute instances. So network tagging is also making sure that, okay, the right VMs have right access to the network tags. Another cool feature that we have is VPC Service Controls. So VPC Service Control allow customer to address threats such as data theft, accidental data loss, and excessive access to data stored in GCP using multi-tenant services. It enables clients to tightly control what entities can access and what, in order to reduce both intentionally and unintentional losses. VPC Service Control addresses the issue of protecting data ingress and egress of GCP, which are accessed via APIs. So this is something that is extremely efficient for masking all your services away from the external network. So this is secured by something called as the service parameter. So it creates a security bounding and a boundary around your GCP resources, and you can configure these service parameter to control communication from your VMs to your Google Cloud Service API. So this is an additional feature that you can use for securing your connectivity by using VPC Service Control. Now, one of the other concepts is identity-aware proxy, right? So cloud identity-aware proxy is another way you can have your network secure. It establishes a central authority for your layering in applications accessed by HTTPS. So you can adopt an application level access control model instead of a network firewall failure. IAP thus ensures that only your authenticated users are provided access to this particular application. Second last concept is nothing but your cloud armor. So obviously we have your DDoS, which is your distributed denial of service, is basically to disrupt or stop any service by overwhelming it with traffic flood. All of us know that DDoS is potentially a common threat across these applications, and there are bots and malicious traffic that can actually take down your entire application. So Cloud Armor is nothing but your protection against those DDoS and WAF protection. So Cloud Armor is delivered at Google's Edge network and block all the attacks. So obviously the first level of trust is you can actually manage it by load balancers and things like that. But having the extra layer of Cloud Armor can help you secure the layer 7 application layer and also access control some of the backend traffic that comes from IP and geo. So it also helps in your security policies based on L3 to L7 request clients and attributes. So that is another way you can secure your application. Just quick time check. Ron, how much time do we have?
We've got another just a couple more minutes, okay?
Okay, sounds good. So let's talk about something. So again, there are a few more concepts that I wanted to cover, which is operational monitoring and also data monitoring. But let's move on to data, because I think that is something which is a little exciting. Oh. Okay. So what do we mean by DLP, right? So data security, by its crux, you have your Google Cloud data, which is encrypted at rest and also in transit. You have a lot of ways to manage your data. There is security encryption keys that are provided by Google, and also you can have your own managed encryption key. Now there is a new concept or a new product that was launched, which was called data loss prevention. So it basically masks your PII data into like hash or stars or whatever you want to name it, and make your data more secure. So a real-time way of actually seeing this is your DLP is made of 3 pillars, which is your which is your discovery, your classification, and that helps you in identifying those inbuilt classifiers that you have based on whatever needs you might have. One real GIF that I wanted to kind of show is here. So basically, sorry, my bad. So basically what you can see is these are sensitive information, which is phone numbers and emails that are being masked by hash. So this is something that is something that you could use as well. This tip is kind of not related to the DLP, but something which is extremely important is giving your access to your buckets using signed URL. So this is a concept which is probably a little, can be used in our day-to-day as well. So if there is a particular access that you need to give for a bucket, then actually you can create a signed URL and give that URL a temporary access and then mask it using DLP as well. Now, let's move to the last concept that I want to talk about is beyond corp, right? So there is probably no surprise that everyone is talking about zero trust, and especially with COVID pandemic, there has been a huge catalyst for having these zero trust conversations. With many employees being out of office and working remotely, Google has launched its own infrastructure to be available, to make it available for our customers, which is nothing but Beyond Corp. Google has a history with zero trust stemming from our work over the past decade with Beyond Corp, and if not the biggest implementation, we have done it across all our 100K plus employees at Google. So when we talk about Beyond Corp, which is the original architecture, it has been a lot of nuts and bolts that has been added and made it kind of accessible to our own customers, which is Beyond Corp Enterprise. So this is also something that will help you at your application layer and making your entire architecture secure and good to go. With that, I want to just show this particular architecture, which is nothing but where it sits. So Beyond Corp applies in having your employees on the left, kind of having a more secured way. On the right, which are the resources, and the Beyond Corp Enterprise sits in the middle that masks your endpoint, your networking to your cloud, and make sure that the resources that want to access the resources in your organization are securely logging in and have all the access which is needed. I know we spoke a lot about these concepts, but I really want to just thank you for listening to me and thank you for your time.